Good evening and welcome to Information Please, your Peoria Public Library on the air. Bring you information about your library and your community. And this evening is part 2 of a 2-part series with Jenny Fulton, who handles communications for Peoria County. And we're talking about disasters and disaster preparedness. The first part of the show is available on YouTube, so we invite you to go watch that. Hi, Jenny.
Hi, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, well, we spent a lot of time talking about the CIPIO committee, but for somebody who missed last week's show or hasn't had a chance to watch it, let's just review a little bit. What is that committee?
Sure. The Central Illinois Public Information Officers are a local committee, a regional committee, I should say, of public relations and communications professionals from agencies that have a role in responding to disaster, whether it's disaster preparedness, disaster response, recovery after the fact. We're responsible for getting important and accurate information out to the public about the disaster. That's our role as public information officers.
Right, and so that group covers what? How many counties?
Five counties: Peoria, Tazewell, Woodford, Marshall, and Stark counties.
And who do we report to? What are we functioning under?
Well, we actually are a subcommittee of Homeland Security Region 10, which formed after 9/11. So that's been around for a while, and we report back to them on our activities.
Okay, and so our group, who is on our group in this region? What sort of people serve?
We have representatives from law enforcement, local government agencies, libraries, hospitals, health departments, and militaries represented. We have the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, utility companies such as Ameren and Illinois American Water. So it's pretty broad representation, but really if an agency has a role in disaster response or recovery, we request that they have somebody from their agency be represented on our committee. And many of them do have communications professionals.
Right, and so then those folks, and you need a lot of folks because they can't always respond. And some of the things that our committee has done has helped with the floods and the Washington tornado.
Yes, I'll give you an example. We have about 60 people on our committee, and I would say in general 35 of those are very active. They come to our quarterly meetings and they participate in trainings and exercises. During the Washington tornado, 25 members of our committee actively responded. 12 of us were in Washington or Tremont, where the Tazewell County Emergency Operations Center is located.
Right.
And the other 12 or 13 were actually working for their agencies. So the hospital public information officers were actively working at their hospitals. The Red Cross was on site, the Salvation Army was on site. We really had a very active response to that. Right,
and the thing is there's other people who can't always go to our Joint Information Center, which is, we explained that in detail last week, where the information is being vetted and disseminated from to our Facebook page and out to the press. And so it's important to have a lot of people who are well informed and trained, because we're all trained by FEMA.
That's correct.
As well. So
we all are required, if we're going to respond to a disaster, anybody who does respond, whether it's public information officers or first responders such as law enforcement and firefighters, you have to go through a certain amount of National Incident Management System training, which is through the federal government. And obviously public information officers don't require quite the same level of training as those people that are saving lives, but there are a couple of trainings that we have to have taken prior to responding to disaster, and our committee has been through those trainings.
Right, because as we all know, communications are vital. The first thing everybody wants is what happened, and if you're getting incorrect information or you don't know where to go for correct information, that can be a real problem for you and for the people who are trying to help.
It generally does end up being a problem. If people are getting the wrong information, if there's rumors or there's misinformation out there coming from a different source other than the Central Illinois Public Information Officers, then that really could cause a chain reaction of panic almost.
Yes.
So we try to control those. We try to control rumors. We try to correct misinformation, and we present the correct information.
Right, and we did discover during the Washington tornado that there were people who immediately set up Facebook pages and started putting out information which was or was not true. That even led to some fraud, because I think there was some faulty fundraising going on. People just want to do something. I think that's a very human reaction. You want to do something, and so sometimes doing the wrong thing is can hinder all that. Plus, you really can get into trouble with fraud, that kind of thing. So you need to know where to look for the right information, and that would be this committee.
Yes, and the public can go to our Facebook page, which is Central Illinois Emergency Information. I think in this day and age, we will find that any large disaster we respond to, there will always be rogue Facebook pages, we'll call them.
Always. Know which one's the right one, like
Yes.
it, and then know how to search for it to find it.
That's
if it's not showing
right.
up in your feed.
Really, we encourage people to like our page prior to disaster so that they're already
Yes.
tuned into the correct source of information. The trouble with those other Facebook pages is they're not on scene. The largest one that popped up after the Washington tornado, the facilitators of that page, the managers of that page actually were out of Florida.
Yeah.
We are on scene. We have public information officers on scene. We have them in the Emergency Operations Center. We have them dealing with the media, and we filter the information gathered from those public information officers to the communications hub, make sure the information is accurate, and then put it out to Facebook and put it out to the press, as you said.
Right, right. So that all works great. And last week we talked extensively about preparing for the kind of disasters we're used to here, preparing for flooding, preparing for tornadoes, fire. Those are the things that normally happen to folks in Central Illinois. But one of the things we were more recently trained in is sheltering in place in a different kind of disasters. And that becomes more of a reality as our world changes. We talked about terrorist attacks, we talked about dirty bombs. What FEMA has discovered is that we make all these plans for evacuation. We all know how to get out of the building. We all know what we're supposed to do if you're trapped in your home for a tornado. What we don't think about is the unexpected emotional response that occurs. And so this training that we recently attended was about that, how to work through all that stuff before it happens. So what we wanted to do today was talk extensively about that and hope people can talk about it with their coworkers, with their families, and make even more plans, but add in that emotional piece that can make things go wrong, that can cause you to panic, the thing you didn't think about before. And we should know too that if people want someone to come and train a group, we do have people who can come and do that. And it's not so much training as it is leading a discussion.
It really is, yes.
And making you aware and asking the right questions to think about, well, what would you do if this? What would you do if that?
It was, in my opinion, this is an entirely different tact for emergency planning than FEMA or county government or other units of government had done in the past. And it's called a whole community approach. And it was very interesting. We had a gentleman come to our area from FEMA, and he conducted this training for a couple of groups, and you were at one of them, and I was at both of them, and it was really interesting because even though the presentation was exactly the same, the outcome from both of those trainings that I attended were completely different because you have different people in the room with different backgrounds and experiences bringing things to the table. But what FEMA is trying to do is involve the general public, the people who end up being affected by disasters, like the Washington residents that were affected by the tornado, involve them in the preparedness phases and the planning phases of disasters so that we have a better sense of how they're actually going to respond to disaster. So prior, emergency planning for local governments basically meant how are our response agencies going to respond? It didn't necessarily mean how are the people affected by disaster going to respond. So if we assume when we make our plans that everybody is going to do A, the people who lost their homes are going to do this, and then the disaster strikes and everybody instead does B because that's the natural response, then our plans go out the window because we didn't take this into consideration. We took this into consideration.
So somebody with a planning brain said, we will all do this, and forgot to think about the reality of it.
People's reaction and what, I'll give you an example. We have an evacuation plan and a shelter plan in place for the courthouse. So if a tornado comes through the courthouse where I work, we go down to the ground level and the basement levels and shelter in place. And about a mile from the courthouse are where two of my youngest children go to daycare. So if the tornado hits the courthouse, there's a good chance that it might affect the building that my children are in. And there's other coworkers at the courthouse who have children in the same daycare. I have to say, I know I'm supposed to shelter in place, and I'll probably stay at the courthouse until the tornado passes. But then I'm not sticking around to check in with my supervisor and say I'm okay. I'm headed over to daycare, and probably the other coworkers of mine who have children in the same daycare are leaving to go check on their kids as well. That's the natural reaction. But the plan says we're supposed to shelter in place and then report in and, you know, let everybody know we're okay. And that's a good plan. But in reality, that may not be what happens. And I understand the reason for the plan. You know, you don't want to look for people who you think are missing when actually they're not and they're fine and they've just gone to check on their kids. I understand that. But my emotions and my responsibility is different than my manager's. So I'm
People
quite
react
frankly,
differently.
yes. And so
Well,
we need to know that before we make those plans.
Yeah, exactly. And the tornado is very typical. And of course, there's been, you know, new terror threats about things going off. And here, unfortunately, is a picture of a dirty bomb. And this could be something that happens in our country. And one of the scenarios we did, and I think it's a good one, is we met in the Peoria Public Library, in the main library, which is a huge building. You know, we have 5 floors. A lot of people don't realize we have 5 floors. It was built as a bomb shelter, though. That auditorium is actually a nuclear bomb shelter. What would happen if you were in downtown Peoria, you're in the library, or you're just out on the street, or you're having lunch at the Pier Marquette, or whatever, and somebody sets off a dirty bomb at the federal courthouse, and they immediately send everybody to Peoria Public Library down to the lower level and tell you you're not leaving for 24 hours. You cannot get out. You're going to have the library staff. You're going to have anybody who was in the library. You may have people from outside. And they had us work through the entire, what is there to eat? What is there to drink?
Right.
You know, how are you going to keep track of people? How are you going to feel about the people you're trapped in this room with?
Right.
And I'm not sure what you did at the courthouse with your training.
We did the same scenario. But what's interesting is one of the very first things that the FEMA man asked was, what is a dirty bomb? And there were probably 4 different answers.
Yeah.
And the definition of a dirty bomb is it has radioactive materials in it. And some of us thought, well, it has nails in it, like the Boston bomb.
Like a scatter bomb kind of thing.
Yes, some other type of ingredients, I guess, in it. But it's technically radioactive material. Now, most of the time, I would think that when a bomb goes off outside your building, whether you're in the library and a bomb goes off outside the library or at the courthouse and it goes off, your instinct is to go towards the window to see what happened, or go out the doors to see what happened, or to check on people that might have been injured.
Right.
Is to go outside.
Yeah.
And in a dirty bomb situation, that's the last place you want to be, because that's where the radioactive material is. So you really have to, you know, you wouldn't even know it's a dirty bomb. It's not like you're seeing this cloud of yellow stuff floating through the air.
Yeah, and you're not seeing these guys for a while yet.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it could be hours before first responders realize it was a dirty bomb. And I think that creates a whole situation where you're going to have people that go outside, but technically in this situation, you should be sheltering in place. And you're exactly right. Who are you sheltering in place with? And are you prepared to spend 12 to 24 hours with these people in a small room?
Yeah. And
It seems like a large room when there's a few people in there, but when you get 50 people in there,
yeah, then what?
it's small very quickly.
and people you don't know, and people are hungry, and some of the things we talked about were, what about medication? Do you have medication with you that if you're told you cannot leave here for 24 hours, are you going to be all right? Can you survive without it? Should you have some with you? But then the second question comes, what if you're responsible for grandpa who's at home on oxygen? And what are in daycare,
Right.
kids in daycare? And so this whole training, you know, went through, do you have plans for if you can't get there? And really, quite honestly, that could be true for a snowstorm in this area or a tornado, that you could have someone, and there's not necessarily going to be somebody that can get to them to help them or be able to get you your medication.
That's what was so interesting about this training. And as Tricia said, we are happy to provide this to groups in the community that are interested in taking it, because it gets you thinking about things that you didn't normally think about. We think about, okay, we have a disaster plan in place, we practice the plan, we have our points of contact, we have our supply kit, and that's the extent of it. But when you're thinking about every day I take my pill at 9 o'clock before I go to bed, and you're not there at 9 o'clock because you're stuck at the library still sheltering in place, are you going to be okay if you miss the pill?
Yeah.
Or do you have a backup pill on your person because your purse may be in a different room that you can't get to?
That you can't get to it.
Or if it's in your desk or wherever it may be, you just, you don't think about those things until it's brought to your attention and you have this open discussion. You know, when we were in that training, there were people that said, I do check on my parent every night, or I help them get dinner, and you don't show up. Are they going to be okay? Are they going to get their own dinner? Are they, going to turn the stove on and forget to shut it off? Those type of things. So who's going to be there in your place? And then they're worrying about you because you didn't show up.
You didn't show up. What's wrong with you? They don't know how to get a hold of you. They may not have any comprehension of what's going on. So it's, do you have someone who can fill in for you? We talked too about food and water, which we talked about, okay, at the library, if there's no power and no water, what would you do? Well, we've got a certain number of vending machines. We also have party supplies for all our programs we do, but we talked about what would there really be to eat, and you'd go through the vending machine.
And people get cranky when they don't eat.
Yeah, people get cranky, and then you've got temper, and do you have someone, is there someone who knows how to do crowd control? Is there, do you have someone who can deal with people who are anxious? Do you know who on your staff or who in your neighborhood has first aid training? All these things. Do you know, is there people who understand what all of this might mean and can provide some information? There's just, it's a completely different way of planning for a disaster.
It is. It was, you're presented this scenario, and in our cases it was the dirty bomb, but it could be any type of disaster. It could be a severe snowstorm. It could be an extended power outage. And you walk through it, and you have to let your thoughts go where you don't want them to go, okay? If I'm trapped in the courthouse because of a dirty bomb outside and my kids are down the street at the daycare and there's a dirty bomb, air is headed that way too, obviously that's my biggest fear. I can't run out and open the door of the daycare, and then I've exposed myself, and now if I open the door of the daycare, I've exposed all those children in there.
Right.
And this could happen before you even realize it's a dirty bomb, which is a terribly scary thought.
It is.
It's terribly scary, but I think in this day and age, it's a reality that we at least have to be aware of.
I think it is too. And I think the other thing that some places have trained for it, some haven't, but it's another shelter-in-place situation, is an active shooter, which any public place is liable to have, any workplace these days. And whether it's a terrorist, it's an irate employee, it's just somebody out to make a name for themselves, someone with a grudge. And there's been a lot of information too about active shooters and the idea of hide and don't run. And one of the things they say is when you run, the shooter can see you, so you need to hide somewhere, and you also want to be somewhere with stray bullets might give you some protection, metal garbage can, a heavy desk, whatever.
Yeah, there's actually 3 reactions. Evacuate if you have the opportunity and you're not in the line of sight of the shooter. Then your best option is to clear out of the area if you can. You don't want to draw attention to yourself, though, running away. If that's not an option, then hiding, sheltering in place is the next best option. And as you said, find a place where he can't see you and hopefully isn't likely to see you. And if you're able to get into a room where you can lock the door or block the door, or into a closet or an area like that, you'd be better off. And then lastly, if there's no other choice and you're confronted, then fight. And obviously that's a last resort because he's armed, but try to run if you can, hide if you must, and then fight if it's if there's no other option for you.
I recently heard about a school that has all the students have heavy cans of fruit and vegetables in their desk. And they're trained that if a shooter comes in, everybody pelts them with cans, which I guess if in your library you got a lot of heavy books you could get them with. But
yeah, that too is a very scary situation. And I know in Peoria County, because I work for Peoria County, the city of Peoria and the county law enforcement agencies work with all of the schools in our jurisdiction on being prepared for an active shooter situation. And a lot of this came about after Sandy Hook, of course.
yes,
Because we certainly don't want another Sandy Hook.
no, never.
But I think that with the help of law enforcement, these schools are better and better prepared to handle any situation.
I've heard of some of those situations, but I do think that this is something that could happen in any public place, whether it's the courthouse, the library, any of the big conferences we hold at the Civic Center.
Yep.
It could happen anywhere. And I think it behooves people, particularly if you work in a public place or a place that people tend to come into a lot, is it only takes a minute to look around and see, where are my hiding places? When you go into a conference or convention, look and see the exits. I mean, we've all been trained to do that our whole lives, and we don't do it. It's just like you don't listen to the airplane evacuation lecture when you get on an airplane, what to do in an emergency. Nobody ever listens. But if you're go back to your workplace or where you commonly go out to eat or where you attend meetings and see, if I had to get out of here, where could I get out? If I had to hide, where could I hide? And those are just the kind of things that can prepare you a little bit. And working at the library, of course, where we have plenty of books about fictional disasters and movies about fictional disasters, I think maybe you can get some ideas for some of those. And I honestly think people with vivid imagination, some people just don't like to deal with that. Some people always say, oh, I don't read that kind of thing. They like, to read nonfiction, or they like to read romances or whatever. But I do think for those people who watch movies and read books about disasters and people who find unique ways to survive, maybe can have some other ideas and are a little better prepared. So
yeah, and I think there's I believe it was United Way put out a nice book after the Washington tornado on real life responses to that. And so there's nonfiction out there for those people who prefer that too, about events that have occurred and suggestions from the people that have been through it. But one of the things that we're really trying to get people to do is just think about disasters, and we don't want everybody to live in fear that something terrible is going to happen in an hour or tomorrow or whatever, but we just want people to have the thought in their head, and as they're going, as you mentioned, to different places, just think, well, what would I do if this happened? And don't do it all the time.
Don't obsess. Don't obsess.
Right.
But if you regularly attend, something at the Civic Center. Church. Church is another place too. Churches have been attacked by shooters.
That's right.
Think where, what would I do? Where are the exits? And I think that just doesn't hurt. And it's, it's probably not the strange place you're at. It's probably the place you're at all the time.
It's like they say, if you're involved in an automobile accident, it's most likely to be within 2 miles of your home.
Yeah, because that's where you are the most. It's a percentage deal. It's because that's where you are, so higher percentage, higher risk. So this is something that's more likely to happen to you in a place that you're at all of the time.
And just to reassure people, I mentioned how law enforcement is working with schools, but they train regularly on all these different types of scenarios. Tornado response, fire response, active shooter response. It was just last September they had an active shooter drill at Northwoods Mall on a Sunday morning before the mall opened. And they had the Central Illinois Emergency Response Team in there and practicing what they would do in a real situation. And they routinely do this. The first response agencies routinely practice and train and adjust their plans accordingly when something doesn't work the way they thought it would.
And that's what makes it go so much smoother, because they are prepared. They have thought it through. People are familiar with the equipment. They're familiar with the layout of the area, which our committee has participated in quite a few exercises. Everything from plane crashes to, I don't know,
to
a lot
hazmat and
hazmat. Hazmat's another one, which is train wreck, something happens on the river, and that's another thing that could cause people to shelter in place in, anywhere along the train tracks or downtown Peoria. If something leaks, something blows up. We've done those scenarios several times.
Yeah, generally we try to do a large exercise with our first response partners at least once a year, so that they know who we are as public information officers and we know who they are as first responders.
Well, and I know that our friends that set up the medical triage stuff get to practice every year when they go to the music festival out at Three Sisters Park, and they get all their equipment out. It's all checked. They actually get to work on real people, so they're not going year after year after year without dealing with that field setting with lots of practice of folks, and it's usually sunburn and
Sure, other things
other
that may
things
happen
that
there.
go on at music festivals, a few emergencies, but they do get good practice. And the main thing is that equipment is all taken out and used extensively and thoroughly, so when something happens, you're not pulling it out and finding, oh, this rotted or fell apart or whatever. So
Yes, I think there's several real world events that occur throughout the year that allow these agencies to practice their plans. The 4th of July event on the riverfront is one, and Steamboat Days and some of those other events. Just emergency response agencies open up an emergency operations center to manage security at those events, and that is great practice for
everybody.
something different.
Yeah. Jenny, thank you so much for
Sure.
taking all this time, and I hope we've helped people prepare. If you need more information about emergency planning, you can contact Peoria County. You can contact Peoria Public Library. We can get you in touch with the right people. But we are available to train folks to think about sheltering in place, and there's plenty of information out there on emergency preparedness. So be safe this spring. Watch both these shows on YouTube and share them with your friends and family. We'll see you next week on Information Please.